Canadians have an obligation to speak up for free expression. And I can condemn views with which I disagree, but that's not what the question is. The question is whether we as a government, we're being called upon to, quote, condemn any and all attempts by groups or individuals to promote a certain issue here or abroad. It's that which I'm concerned about. The words I focused upon were words like promote and condemn. That's about free speech, and that's what I was trying to say during my remarks.
Some comments. The honourable member for Scarborough Agincourt.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I want to thank my friend from Victoria for his speech. And I have a significant amount of respect for the positions that he advocates in this particular House. And I specifically want to call upon, and I too, I'm going to be frank, that I myself am struggling with the motion that is before this particular House. And I want to know whether this member would be supportive of this particular resolution if we simply had deleted the last part of the particular matter before the House that goes on that says, and calls upon the government to condemn any and all attempts by Canadian organizations, groups and individuals to promote the BDS movement. I think we all agree that we have opposition to BDS, but it is that latter part. And if that part were in fact deleted, would he and his caucus colleagues support the motion?
The honourable member for Victoria.
I appreciate the suggestion and the comments of my honourable friend from Scarborough, with which I have a lot in common, and I appreciate very much his thoughts. The problem with doing so, I think, is just from a legal point of view that is the gravamen of the section. It's about, after the initial language, it talks about calling upon the government to condemn thus and so and individuals who promote that. That, it seems to me, is the burden of the motion. That is what we're here primarily after the hortatory language with which I totally agree, by the way. That's why it's difficult to sever it in any way that would make any sense and leave any meaning on the table. And that's why I found it so difficult to accept the idea of simply severing it.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, and again, I'm struck by my colleague's eloquence, and thank him very much for a very strong speech here. There's a couple things that have kind of struck me. First of all, I'm surprised the Liberals have indicated they're going to support this. What is a badly worded motion and is really doing disservice to the House that we have to waste time. I'd much rather see some more government bills, because we haven't seen any of those yet. So I'm hoping that we will get an idea of what the government's agenda is very soon. But I was trying to figure out the mechanism by which a government would condemn an individual's questions. What is the mechanism here? So we say this motion passed. It looks like the government side is going to support this. What is the specific mechanism? How are we going to condemn individuals for supporting or opposing a particular motion? If you have any idea, or is it just kind of a poppycock motion that we've wasted a whole Thursday on?
The honourable member for Victoria.
I struggled with the question that my honourable friend posed. I don't know the instrument by which the Conservatives believe we should action this motion. How do we, do we put a newspaper ad with the Government of Canada logo on it? I don't know. It's unclear and it's vague, and it goes back to the point with which I started my remarks. Not that I wish to be provocative, not that I wish to turn what I fear has become a partisan debate, but this is about trying to divide Canadians for political purposes, and I resent and am angry and saddened by that, by where we are as a consequence.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my friend for his speech. It was indeed very eloquent and passionate. Sadly, it was very wrong as well, at law, which surprises me from this learned member who is a lawyer. He would know well that the Keegstra case of the Supreme Court of Canada, which dealt with anti-Semitism itself, Mr. Speaker, said that there can be a reasonable limit to free speech when there's the promotion of hatred towards an identifiable group. But why he's really wrong, Mr. Speaker, is not the Supreme Court case. This is not limiting freedom. This is actually rejecting and condemning. As parliamentarians who represent all Canadians of all faiths, we have a duty to condemn conduct that is clearly the thin edge of the wedge, promoting hatred towards an identifiable group by dressing it up in other ways, Mr. Speaker. So would that member tell this House, especially given his background working in national security, how some of these legitimate fronts to hate groups, like a business boycott, are actually the mechanisms to try and normalize hate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Victoria.
I thank my friend, fellow lawyer who I know has studied these issues as well. The Keegstra case, a 1990 Supreme Court of Canada case, was a 4-3 split in the Supreme Court, in which, as I thought I said, the Supreme Court upheld Canada's hate speech restrictions. And there was a strong philosophical difference between the judges in that case. As for Section 2D of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act, with which he just referenced, about subversion and other issues of speech, there's a careful balance, which was the subject of months of debate in this place before they got it right. And that is what I say needs to be done in this context as well. If we want to criminalize speech, let's do it right in the criminal code. We've done it before. Let's use the charter and let's find the right balance, rather than a bald statement about why this is bad.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Victoria for his statements. In many respects, we agree on a lot of issues. We obviously don't agree on this one. I'd like to turn his attention to, he talked about Brandenburg, but Brandenburg was trying to put a guy who was at a Nazi rally in prison for 1 to 10 years. Keegstra was an attempt to put somebody in prison for speech. The Conservative motion is not, this is where we're going off all wrong. The Conservative motion that was put forward, that I agree with, is not trying to put anyone in prison. It's not trying to say that speech goes in the criminal code. It's simply trying to say that we denounce speech or condemn speech that is, to me, anti-Semitic or racist or xenophobic. And I think that's perfectly appropriate. So I would like to ask, because the honourable member says, you know, and I agree, we will defend to the death somebody's right to say something, but if the honourable member had in this wording, instead of BDS, the word anti-Semitism or racism or homophobia, would he then also be against the motion?
For Victoria.
Well, I thank my friend, and I respect enormously the contribution he made to this debate earlier today. And I want to say that in general terms, my reference to the Brandenburg case was simply to point out the high watermark or the low watermark of the United States. By contrast to Canada, which after the Maxwell-Cohen recommendations came up with a very balanced, thoughtful arrangement, which was upheld in Keegstra in one case and struck down in Zundel in another. And I'm simply saying to simply have a bald statement condemning speech is wrong. And I think that's not the way Canadians do business, and I think that is why I thought I needed to ground this motion in a broader description of the Canadian legal system, so Canadians would know that freedom of expression remains a protected value in our country, but that there are values on, if there's violence involved or if there's other aspects, yes, we should condemn it, and we have laws to deal with it. Not a bald statement about views with which we disagree.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I often like to say that everyone's a Democrat when they win. But the true test of a Democrat is how they act when they lose. With free speech, it's easy to support free speech with which we agree. But the true test of whether we actually believe in the right to free speech is how we act and react to speech with which we disagree. Now, you know, I'm listening to this argument that says, well, what are we doing? It's just a motion to have the government condemn a belief or an expression of a Canadian. We're not actually doing anything. The road to erosion of rights always begins with a wedge in the door. First, it's about condemning. Next, it's about restricting. Then it becomes about punishing. Then it becomes about banning. It's always a slippery slope. So I reject this notion that by just having the government condemn something, we don't start down the path of a road where the government, as is called for by this motion, starts to tell Canadians what they can and cannot agree with. So I'd like to ask my friend, does he agree with the positions expressed by some members of this House that merely having the government condemn things is a harmless act of government?
Honourable member for Victoria.
I thank my friend for his thoughtful question, and I think it is indeed problematic, and slippery slope is an old cliche, but I do worry about it. If we start making condemnations, blanket condemnations of views which are impossible or indeed abhorrent in certain places, it's a slippery slope because then people will say, what are you going to do about it? An earlier question raised the same thing. How are you going to action this particular condemnation? I think the question is an excellent one with which I agree.